until about 30 years ago, trade politics was fairly simple. It was sometimes a bit contentious, but it used to be contentious on much narrower grounds than it is today. Trade agreements in this earlier period were mostly about lowering tariffs. So you had import competing industries facing off against export industries. So unions and companies in the import competing sector were opposed to trade agreements, and here think of textiles and agriculture, whereas competitive companies who wanted to conquer export markets were in favor of trade agreements, and politicians lined up with the industries in their state. So trade politics was this classic battle between free traders and protectionists. I'm oversimplifying a bit here, but this is the general picture I think is accurate. But then in the past 30 years, the situation evolved considerably, and trade agreements expanded in scope. It's not just about trade liberalization anymore. It's a lot more complex. We have rules on labor. We have rules on the environment. We have rules on intellectual property, and some general rules that sort of are cross-cutting. And I don't want to go too much into investor-state dispute settlement, but we have these sort of broad obligations that let foreign investors sue for a wide range of things. So just about any domestic law or regulation is subject to challenge. So the result is that the implementing legislation for trade agreements looks a lot like your normal domestic policy legislation. There's a lot of provisions that are added at the request of a wide range of interest groups. And what that means is assembling a package of provisions that can pass Congress is much more difficult than what we used to see with trade agreements. So we still have in the trade debate that traditional free trade versus protectionism clash, but we also have so much more. The Obama administration sort of knows all that, and taking that into account, they had to figure out how are we going to sell trade agreements to Congress and to the American people. And as I see it, they've taken kind of a three-pronged approach to that. First, they want to keep the traditional free market, free trade conservatives, or some liberals too, on board with this, with enough of the traditional trade liberalization. As Dan said, we may not be happy with how much is in there, but we hope there's some, and we're eagerly awaiting the details so we can evaluate just how much is in there. So that's the first prong. The second is to bring in some liberals with some things that liberals like. I'll talk more about that. And then third is to add a security component. Dan alluded to this too. There's all this talk about China to get some security hawks on board with this as well. So I'm going to talk briefly about each one, and then I'm going to go into greater detail about two particular examples of the second one, which is getting some liberals on board here. So first up is this free market pitch for the TPP. So traditionally, if you're a free market supporter, as I am, you might talk about how trade agreements reduce tariffs or customs duties. These are sort of the common terms, how they make us better off by lowering import prices. What the Obama administration has done, and I feel like this is a bit novel, I don't know, Dan, maybe you've seen it before, they want to characterize the tariff reductions as tax cuts. And so there's this talk of how there's going to be 18,000 tax cuts on sales of U.S. products abroad. What is this? Is this sort of blatant pandering to folks like Dan and me, a clever strategy to get free market conservatives excited about all of this? I think it's actually a good way to emphasize to conservatives the free market part of the TPP. And I've probably done the same thing myself at some point, referring to lowering tariffs as tax cuts. It does, I admit, make me roll my eyes a little bit when I hear people who don't usually say much about tax cuts talk about tax cuts. But overall, I think it's actually a good idea, and I think it could play well. So that's sort of the free market side of things. So now the second part, the Obama administration knows it's not enough to get the free market conservatives on board. They need to appeal to the left as well. So they've suggested that past trade agreements are problematic. This one, TPP, is new and improved. They are calling it the most progressive trade agreement in history. It spreads U.S. values such as labor protections and environmental protection. The question I have about this is anyone on the left who was opposed to trade agreements going to shift their position in response to this? And I'm a little skeptical, but we'll see. Now, in a couple minutes, I'm going to talk about two specific examples of issues that they've played up. One is the minimum wage, and the other is, as Dan mentioned, this sort of unfavorable treatment of tobacco. Okay, so the third part of the Obama administration's approach is the appeal to patriotism and security, in particular by playing up the fear of China. As Dan said, this is part of the part of the pivot to Asia in foreign policy. And they've made clear many times that this is about, it's important for America to write the rules on global trade, not let China write the rules. So to me, this seems like part of a larger strategy to build up a rival that we need to be worried about, and in this way, sort of to create a security component for the TPP. So, will this three-pronged strategy work? Does the Obama administration have the balance right? Can they bring in new supporters without alienating? Can they bring in new supporters without creating new opponents? In particular, can they bring in some liberals without alienating conservatives? Because of the expansion of trade agreements, it's gotten very hard to balance out all of the competing groups out there. So to take one example, Dan mentioned this one too, one big battle in the TPP has been over the protection, intellectual property protection, in particular for these biologic drugs. So on the one side, you have public health groups who want less protection. And then on the other, you have the pharmaceutical companies and their supporters in Congress who want more protection. And the general verdict has been that, and as we've talked about, we haven't seen the TPP text yet, but from what we've heard about, the general verdict is that the result in the TPP was more favorable to the public health groups than maybe they even expected. But that means the pharmaceutical industry didn't get what they wanted, so you have people like Senator Orrin Hatch who are not happy with the result. So the question is, did the Obama administration get the balance right on this issue and a variety of other issues? So just to conclude on this big picture, I mean, having broadened the agreements in the way into various aspects of social policy, it's very hard to get this right balance, and the TPP is kind of a test of whether we have it right or whether there are adjustments that still need to be made. So that's kind of a general, some general thoughts on this, but now let me get into some very specific points to kind of illustrate the difficulty of all of this. The first one is the minimum wage. And the minimum wage is part of sort of the larger labor protections that are in trade agreements. And the labor protections first became part of trade agreements in the NAFTA in 1993 in kind of non-binding form. There was a commission set up to study these issues, but it really didn't have much impact. By the 2000s, labor protections were enforceable and real. We actually have some litigation going on right now in the CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, where the United States is alleging that Guatemala's not properly enforcing its labor laws, and we should actually have a panel report soon telling us whether Guatemala is doing enough. So currently we have, generally speaking, binding and enforceable labor protections. So far, though, we haven't really had much on the minimum wage, but people are talking as if there will be something more in the TPP about the minimum wage. So past trade deals might have said that if you have a minimum wage law on the books, you have to enforce it. But for a while, the Obama administration has been talking as if there's going to be something more in the TPP and suggesting that maybe there's actually going to be a requirement that every country who's part of the TPP adopt a minimum wage law. I've talked about this with various conservatives who are connected and know things about what's going on in politics, and they have suggested, well, there's no way this could happen. This would be unacceptable. But nevertheless, if you read the reports of what might be in the TPP, the Obama administration is still, I think, pushing the idea that there's going to be something more, something new here, some kind of requirement for at least some countries maybe to adopt a minimum wage law. So if that's true, that's a very big new development, and it raises some questions for me. So first, one is, could you adopt a minimum wage law that says the minimum wage is 1 cent per hour, has to be at least 1 cent per hour, making it just sort of formalistic and meaningless? In theory, you could do that. Would anyone actually do this? I don't know. It seems absurd to have this approach, but technically maybe this is possible. Practical question: does any TPP country not have a minimum wage law? From what I've seen so far, Brunei and Singapore are the ones that do not. So they would be the ones affected by this. If this applied to all the countries, they would then have to adopt a minimum wage law. Here in the United States, obviously, we already have a minimum wage law. But does having this requirement in the TPP mean we could never repeal it? There are people out there who would probably like to repeal it. Not that it's politically realistic, but it would be frustrating for them not to even have that opportunity. So there's lots of unanswered questions about the minimum wage and what the TPP will do with it. But back to the topic for the day, U.S. politics. what are the implications of the TPP having some sort of requirement for all of these countries to adopt a minimum wage? My sense sometimes reading about this is there are some people on the left who don't really understand how important an issue this is for free market folks. They might see this as more conservatives just being pro-corporate or being mean. But for free market people, it's very important in two ways. One, it's just sort of generally the concept of economic liberty, being able to sign the contracts that you want, but also the fact that much of the economic research shows that minimum wage laws mean lost jobs. So the key political question here is, will Republicans object to the expansion of the labor chapter to include a requirement for adopting the minimum wage? So this is one of the many questions I'm going to ask that I won't be able to answer, but I'm putting it out there as a question, and if people in the audience have thoughts on it, I'd be happy to hear it. Second issue I want to talk about in just a couple more minutes, and I'll wrap it up and we'll take some questions. Second issue is tobacco. Dan mentioned this one. There's a long history of controversy with the treatment of tobacco in trade agreements. There was perhaps some bad judgment by governments many years ago, by the U.S. government in trade negotiations and litigation related to tobacco. So in the late 1980s and 1990s, the U.S. government was pushing for lowering tobacco tariffs, and they were pushing for removing protectionism in tobacco regulations. But beyond that, it seemed sometimes that they were actually pushing against public health measures, more general anti-smoking measures. And the government worked closely with the tobacco industry in this litigation and negotiation. Well, public health groups got very upset by this, and they began calling for a general carve-out of tobacco from trade agreements. They wanted no attacks on regulations, no reductions in tariffs of any sort. They just wanted tobacco explicitly excluded. And they seemed to believe that the core problem here was the behavior of Western companies, and that it would be better if developing countries were able to have state-owned monopolies. And somehow this would be better for public health. But in my view, cooler heads prevailed on this, and we got to a middle ground where the U.S. government would push for reduction of tariffs and removal of discriminatory measures, but if something was a legitimate public health measure, that would be okay. That seemed like a reasonable compromise. But then along came these rules on investor protection that Dan mentioned. So it's a set of rules that allow foreign investors to sue host governments in an international tribunal for certain kinds of bad treatment they receive. Commonly known as Investor State Dispute Settlement, ISDS. This is something Senator Elizabeth Warren has been vocally complaining about recently. And in our opinion, as Dan mentioned, we don't think this is necessary. It's not an important part of these agreements, but it's in there. Business groups like it. It's hard to get rid of it, just like the Ex-Im Bank. So there have been hundreds of these ISDS lawsuits, and 2 of them brought by tobacco companies against public health measures. But in reaction to those 2 cases, people have argued that we need to exclude tobacco from these provisions. And the response, apparently, from what we've heard about the TPP, is there will be some kind of carve-out of tobacco from the ISDS provisions. To me, this approach makes no sense. It's sort of acknowledging that there's a fundamental flaw in ISDS, but then it's explicitly deciding not to solve it. We're just going to take tobacco out, but we're going to leave the rest of the problem there. But anyway, that's what they've done, apparently. So what's the big deal with the tobacco carve-out in terms of politics? I think Dan alluded to both of these points. First is that it sets a precedent by discriminating against a particular product. I mean, it's not something you normally see in trade agreements, and it's sort of a slippery slope. I mean, what happens if we go down this road? What comes next? Soda, as we've heard recently, bacon. You can imagine all these other carve-outs that you would have. Perhaps more important, though, is that there are particular members of Congress, Senator Mitch McConnell, other tobacco state members, who will really dislike the idea of tobacco being targeted this way. And the question is, will they hate this provision so much that they will withhold support for TPP as is, and maybe wait for an opportunity to reopen it and you might like everything else about TPP, but just not this part of it. So is there a way to get the TPP but without this provision? So I've raised lots of questions. I don't think I've answered many of them. So at this point, I think maybe we'll wrap it up and leave it to you to ask your own questions or help answer some of the questions that I've raised.